This is the McKinsey Podcast, where we help you make sense out of our world's toughest business challenges.
Welcome to the show. I'm Lucia Rahilly.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Gen AI talent is poised to quit, and money won't inspire them to stay. Here's McKinsey Senior Partner, Aaron Smet.
Some of the factors that make the biggest difference are having caring leaders, meaningful work, flexible work, and feeling a sense of inclusivity and belonging.
Aaron joins me and partner Brooke Weddle to discuss how employers can motivate Gen AI talent to stick around.
In our second segment, we're introducing a series that we're calling CEO Insights. It'll feature short, sharp perspectives on the evolving role of the CEO. To kick things off, we'll hear from McKinsey partner Julia McClatchy, a leader in our global CEO initiative. She'll tell us why chief executives must be their company's chief storytellers.
Aaron and Brooke, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Great to be here.
So today, Gen AI, it's obviously a juggernaut with the potential arguably to reshape work as we know it. It's early days, but Gen AI skills are already in demand in many fields as leaders try to realize some of this value that it promises. And yet, your new research shows that talent who are skilled in Gen AI are likelier to quit than the rest of us Luddites. Brooke, tell us about this top-line finding and why employers should care.
I think the point is people who are most fluent in some of the skills required to engage with Gen AI, to build use cases around Gen AI are flight risks at this point. And that's an important finding, given that many companies are trying to upskill and reskill relative to Gen AI and a broader set of technological capabilities in-house versus acquiring them. And so I think companies should be paying attention to that finding and thinking about what they can do to prevent that flight risk and specifically engage that creator and heavy user talent when it comes to Gen AI.
And just for context, as part of this research, what constitutes Gen AI talent, quote unquote, and how do they interact with Gen AI in their jobs?
I think it's important to understand that there's different types of Gen AI workers. Some of them are Gen AI creators. That's a very small group. Most people who use Gen AI don't even consider themselves technical workers. So 88% of folks said that they are not technical employees, and 12% said they consider themselves technical employees.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, most folks who consider themselves Gen AI talent are not, for example, developers.
Correct.
Or engineers.
Correct.
But employees who use Gen AI to gain efficiencies.
That's right.
What would this kind of non-technical use look like?
Let's take an example of, let's say, a corporate communications worker. If you're a corporate communications worker in a large company, you might do a lot of figuring out what are the messages we want to get out and how do we get them out effectively, including crafting press releases, crafting emails from top executives. A lot of what those communication workers and professionals might do is, say, interview an executive. Let's say the CEO or some other executive who's about to, say, be featured in a town hall or send out an important message to employees. You might interview them to understand what they want to say and then synthesize that into an initial speech. That work of a communications professional could take hours. AI can take hours of work out and let them focus on other things. Like, what is the message? What is the medium? They can be more strategic in their thinking. They can be more creative in how do we get this message out rather than cleaning up transcripts and synthesizing them into talking points.
I think it's also interesting to note our McKinsey Global Institute did research on the most commonly deployed use cases right now in Gen AI. And perhaps surprisingly, the most regularly reported Gen AI use cases by function are in marketing and sales, So you're getting a lot of, first drafting, personalized marketing, drafting of technical documents, and then of course more for service ops, the chatbot function. And I think that might be surprising to people that think this is really being used in highly technical kind of instances. But if you look at the frequency of these use cases, you're seeing something that is much more attached to more, in some cases, mundane tasks.
More than half of these hot Gen AI workers, creators and heavy users, as you describe those segments, present a flight risk to employers. And for obvious reasons, leaders want to keep these folks not just employed, but also productive and engaged. Does either of you want to give a little color there on the stakes of disengagement to companies?
The stakes are huge in two senses. One is employees who are disengaged tend to be far less productive. So you have a group of employees who have, especially when you talk Gen AI, have tremendous potential to be more productive with the application of Gen AI. But when they are disengaged, that productivity goes down markedly, often cut in half or less in terms of productivity. And the productivity is a mix of literally working less, working fewer hours, but also the quality of their work and efficiency of their work for the hours they do put in goes down as the engagement goes down. The second thing is they just leave. At some level, they just leave. And when they leave the company, if they were good at their job and really good at using Gen AI to be better at their job, you've just lost a very valuable talent that has gone somewhere else. And you not only have to replace that talent, but if the reasons why they're leaving are systemic in your organization, you might have more attrition coming with the new talent that you do hire.
Where then, in order to mitigate this risk that employees will either disengage or will leave, where should leaders double down? What did the research tell us about what Gen AI talent cares about day to day?
I'll take that one, Lucia. I think the research was very clear on this front. Compensation is not the driving factor here. It is about flexibility, meaningful work, having reliable, supportive colleagues, teammates, and having a clear sense that the employer is focused on health and well-being. I think it's a mistake to think that companies can move away from having this emphasis on meaningful work and well-being. And so leading companies that I'm working with are saying, yes, we need to get to more productivity and productive outcomes, but we're going to do that by really understanding holistically what employees want and knowing that that is not about just financial incentives.
Can I just dig into this compensation a bit? How is it possible that compensation has fallen as a factor and that people rank it so low? Like, who are these people? Is this like a 90210 zip code?
No, it's extremely important. It's just more binary. Mm-hmm. A lot of people wouldn't even look at a job to begin with if it didn't meet their minimum compensation requirements. But once it meets their minimum compensation requirements, paying more doesn't get you a lot. So I would say in some ways it's probably still the most important factor, but it's binary in a way that many of the other factors are not. The more I'm feel part of a supportive community of collaborative colleagues, the better. The more the better, the more the better, the more the better.
And we heard a lot, as you alluded to, Brooke, about flexibility in previous iterations of this research, particularly during the pandemic and just coming out of it. What's different now about the way flexibility might matter?
I think it is really about having a greater sense of control. And I think it is not just about, am I in the office or not? I think that is a simplification that hasn't been entirely helpful. I think it's about reimagining shifts at work, reimagining whether or not you need to do work with someone else versus on your own. I've been really intrigued by even some of the changes that large traditional manufacturers are making when it comes to understanding how to meet their needs and get older talent into the workforce, how to get moms into the workforce in ways that meet their needs from a childcare perspective. it is not just about kind of the white collar, are we in the office or not? There's been a real broadening of the way in which we think about flexibility that I think should apply to and can apply to tech workers and non-tech workers.
It's not just hybrid or remote work. It's also work schedules. Do I have some autonomy over my schedule? We saw during the pandemic that a lot of people went from a double peak day to a triple peak day. And I think what people are wanting is to be able to set some boundaries and to have some control and autonomy over their schedules. One way to think about the use of Gen AI, as Gen AI takes over routine tasks, the work left for humans to do is more human, and people want to be treated as humans. And so in addition to flexibility and some level of autonomy and well-being, one of the other biggest disconnects between Gen AI talent and frankly talent broadly and employers in terms of what matters is feeling valued by my leaders and by my organization.
Both of you work with clients on these topics every day. How amenable do you find them to enabling this kind of autonomy and flexibility?
I think it varies. I think that the companies that have really done a good job at figuring it out have a very clear connection with the business they're trying to run and the work environment that they are creating to enable that. I think companies get into hard spots when they say, you got to be back at work, and it's not clear to everyday employees what that actually adds in terms of being able to drive the performance outcomes that the company needs to drive. I do think that the majority of employers continue to think about it and continue to try to understand how to make those work environments more conducive to what employees need, balancing that with, I think, some real concerns that have emerged around, is my culture atrophying? Are especially younger talent, kind of talent that has recently entered the workplace, are they getting the apprenticeship they need? So I think some changes in terms of bringing people back, if you will, have been well-intentioned to try to address that, recognizing also that there are, of course, balances to figure out with flexibility and ensuring employees are also kind of meeting their needs with respect to having, an ability to kind of have that independence and autonomy in the way in which they work.
So suppose I'm an employer and I'm looking to pick up some of these Gen AI workers who are poised to leave their current positions. What attracts folks most to a new employer? Let's talk about some of the other factors that matter most in attracting workers to an organization.
Some of the factors that make the biggest difference are having caring leaders, meaningful work, flexible work, and feeling a sense of inclusivity and belonging. Like, I feel like I can come to work. I have a group of people that are supportive, are welcoming. There's some sense of community. These are some of the biggest factors that are making a difference in terms of attracting and retaining this kind of talent.
What do you make of the fact that flexibility dropped from the number one slot in what employees cite as a reason to stay to, 5 or 6 on this ranking in attracting them to a new job?
People are looking for a place where they can feel appreciated, supported, inspired, connected, and that's where they want to be. If they don't have that, the flexibility doesn't matter as much. I think flexibility is becoming table stakes.
There's a lot of general Tom Sawyering that can need to happen to get teams of human employees to produce great work. Whereas if that work is shifting from, for example, junior level employees to an AI, not so much, right?
For so long, we've had a pretty steady definition of, I'll call it hard work. Hard work is, paying attention, taking notes, summarizing, sending it around, right? I mean, that is how managers could tell if someone was doing what they needed to do. They were putting the time in right? Whether it's research or summarizing or synthesizing and doing something productive with that. I think it's an interesting question now. How do you define hard work? If a colleague is able to use Gen AI to rapidly get to, what would otherwise have taken perhaps hours, right? Put in that time, put in that hard work to produce. And I think that's interesting. I think it's potentially, first of all, it requires a new definition. Second, it might require a different way of measuring and managing that. And third, it might really push us on, what is the aspiration? Is it more of the how versus the what? I don't know, Erin, your view, but that seems to me like a question that we should be asking ourselves as we think about, performance management and how to manage teams effectively.
I agree. I think that's a big shift, is how do I measure productivity now that tasks, I used to look at output, but now output for a lot of these routine tasks can be done in seconds by AI. Now I have to look at the quality of the work and the impact of the work, and I can't measure it by hours worked or lines of code written, or a lot of the traditional measures of productivity don't apply in the same way anymore. I need to look at how good is the work. And again, as the work of humans becomes more human, if it's more like an artist or athlete, let's take an artist. How would you performance manage, let's say, a songwriter? If they told you they wrote 100 songs, would that be good? Well, not if the songs were terrible songs and nobody liked them. What if they wrote one amazing, great song and it only took them an hour to write? Would you say, oh, you only wrote one song and it only took an hour? That's not very good. But if that's a great song that you wrote in an hour and it becomes a hit and everybody enjoys that, you would say, oh, that's much better than the person who spent hundreds of hours writing 100 songs that nobody likes. We are not good at performance managing things that are that ambiguous, but the things that are easy to measure, easy to observe, easy to count, those are things AI is taking over. So it's a whole different game, and I don't think we know the answer to the question yet.
Any sense of how Gen AI might alter the way we think about spans and layers in the org hierarchy?
I think in a lot of cases it won't change, but it will change for those that had very broad spans because the work was so routine. I think it will change because that routine will now be done by AI and analytics and robots and machine learning.
Leaders are confronting a scenario where the same employees who are most valuable to retain are also the likeliest to leave. If there are one or two things employers might do now to try to begin to up the odds that their best workers will stay on and stay productive, what would they be?
Create a healthy work environment that emphasizes both productivity and performance and sustainable work practices and well-being. Number two, invest in leaders. And I mean leaders at all levels. Leaders, maybe not even who are people managers, but if we think of every employee as potentially a leader, invest in leaders and leadership that helps create these strong, supportive communities that can actually help people be at their best and be more sustainable in the work they do, and help each other in a collaborative way also be more productive, not just individually, but as teams.
I'd add two things. One, I think, in the research, I was actually a bit surprised by the number of non-users. I think to the extent that it makes business sense, companies should think about, from an upskilling and reskilling perspective, really democratizing or at least broadening access to Gen AI-based tools and use cases. It doesn't seem sustainable, given how fast we are moving on this front, for there to be such a small amount of heavy users and creators. And I think we're already moving in this direction. So I would try to broaden the skill set and the reskilling approach. The other thing I would do is think really holistically about your change management plan. When people move to using Gen AI, saves a lot of time. How can you then help people understand what to do with that time they have created and use that time productively. I don't think people necessarily are going to be able to intuitively create more productive outcomes and use that space without managers and leaders being able to shape that with some intention. And so that is the other push I would make, which is just thinking through how work gets done and how to make sure that time saved turns into productive time.
When I was reading this research, I found it really surprising that respondents reacted in such an overwhelmingly positive way to Gen AI, even if more than 2/3 of them aren't yet using it at work, right? So just 4% of respondents expressed worry about job displacement, which I found incredible.
What they're finding is it's freeing them up to do work that they would rather be doing in the first place. And as they lean into that work, they're saying, wow, I'm adding a lot more value. My job isn't going anywhere. I think there are some cases where there will be displacement, but a lot of those are not for users of AI. So let's say you use AI to look at a call center and you've recorded all this call center and you have your AI like basically come up with a new completely automated version of answering questions because it's cracked the code on 90% of questions that people call in and ask. If those displace actual humans picking up the phone, those humans picking up the phone are not the users of AI. So that kind of displacement, I think, is still a concern. But that's not the users we're tapping into. We're tapping the users who are using AI to help them do a job they're already doing. And what those people are finding is this is helping me and it's not going to replace me. In fact, it's allowing me to put my skills to their best and highest use by clearing out some of the simpler tasks that frankly weren't that value added to begin with.
Larger questions need to be addressed. And this is where I go back to change management and thinking holistically about the human experience as it relates to using Gen AI in the workplace. Work is already changing. And so we've got to learn as we go.
Brooke, Aaron, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia.
Next up, CEOs and their unique ability to tell their company's story. Here's our managing producer, Laurel Moglin, in conversation with McKinsey partner, Julia McClatchy.
Julia, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Laurel. It's great to be here.
Now, a basic question. How important is it for a CEO to be able to tell their organization's story well?
It's mission critical. It's not nice to have anymore. It is a must do. Having a great story creates a virtuous cycle that enables CEOs to build a track record of consistency, to actually take action and accelerate and make change. Second, it facilitates a mutual exchange between the CEO and his or her stakeholders to come up with new ideas and improve the business. And it creates an opportunity to pressure test ideas and collect feedback and improve strategy based on insights. Third, it gives something for teams to rally behind in a strong, consistent message. And our research shows that high-performing organizations are almost 3 times more likely than others to say that their organizations express narratives well.
Oh, I'm so curious about that data point. Do you think it has the effect that people better understand what their purpose is?
I think it is. Right. I think it creates this flywheel because if you're a high performing organization, odds are people from the very top to the front line know exactly what their role is and how they fit into the broader purpose of the organization. Right. And then they also say, yes, of course, we understand our narrative. And we think our company expresses it well because it's fueling us to do what we do every single day to drive value for the company.
So, okay, let's get to it. Broad strokes, how should CEOs think about shaping their organization's story?
The ability to tell a great story is really grounded in a singular narrative that encompasses the CEO's vision and their strategy for the future. CEOs should think about telling their story in 2 lenses. The first lens is being really holistic in nature, right? Because their story has to transcend multiple stakeholder groups, whether they're talking to their board or they're talking to the media or they're talking to their employees. Beyond a great narrative for CEOs, we know that adult learning principles tell us that things have to be communicated in different mediums again and again and again. So repetition and consistency are critically important, which is not something that comes naturally to most people, but great CEOs are able to master.
What are the more granular storytelling elements that CEOs also have to master?
So the first step for a CEO to consider their audience in managing stakeholder relationships. And we talked a moment ago about how a CEO's narrative has to be holistic and consistent nature, which is true. But the way that narrative is delivered, on what cadence, in what depth of candor, should be customized based on the audience. So you can imagine, for example, that the way a CEO might communicate with the media would differ greatly from the radical transparency that he or she might use when communicating with his or her board. The second point is on building a case for change. Given the pace of change and what is expected of a CEO as he or she evolves in role, that narrative has to be renewed across various stages of their life cycle. So while a new CEO, for instance, might be most focused on setting a bold direction or setting the tone for his or her tenure, a more tenured CEO, on the other hand, might need to focus on combating complacency or articulating a vision for what will be the company's next S-curve. So this enables CEOs to really multiply the value of their story over time as they grow in their role. The third point is that CEOs need to inject a strong sense of the why into their narrative. And this means linking whatever it is that they're saying back to the company's purpose so that it feels really grounded. And ideally, CEOs include some of their own personal purpose in that narrative, right? This could look like sharing what drives them to do what they do. It could mean weaving into the narrative what's their personal hope and passion for the company. And this enables the best CEOs to really move beyond that first step of influence to inhabit the mindsets of their audience and injecting a lot of personality into their stories, which ties back to having a firm grasp on their why.
So many leaders have to pay attention to a variety of competing stakeholder issues. What have you found the best CEOs do to manage this balancing act?
We see a few different archetypes of how this materializes and how they then balance opposing views. So I'll share three. The first is sharing versus staging. So you see this a lot on investor calls, in interviews, in large, financial services presentations. But CEOs have the unique ability to share what stakeholders need to know now while laying what we would call breadcrumbs to keep them coming back for more in the future. So this might be an allusion to growth or an allusion to future focus on productivity. But this idea of sharing versus staging for the future. The second is business versus society. So stakeholders, whether that's customers or employees, they care just as much about what you stand for as what you sell. And CEOs have to boldly and confidently represent the company, its values, its ideals, its purpose. And this means speaking out on topics that at times can be divisive and complex, but that's part of their role. The third is self versus collective. They're positioned very uniquely to make communications a team sport. As they establish and develop their own platform, it's a great analogy to think of this as a rising tide lifts all boats. And what we see is that they make communications a core capability. So you see the full top team with a unified and consistent message, both in the marketplace and with employees, so the CEO doesn't have to go at it entirely alone.
Julia, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. That was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening to the McKinsey Podcast. I'm Lucia Rahilly.
And I'm Roberta Fasaro.
Find us on McKinsey.com. We'll have a transcript of this episode up shortly.
And download the McKinsey Insights app, where you can find this podcast and other helpful content updated daily.
If you enjoyed the show, we'd love for you to leave a rating and a review.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.